So hello and welcome to the Big Three, where we focus on one topic from the world of cybersecurity, and I'll be asking three key questions. With me to provide expert insight are three cybersecurity professionals who have a wealth of experience between them to discuss whether ransomware is an exponential threat to society. And we've extended the time for today's topic to 60 minutes. So thank you for joining us today in this live webinar. I'm Ade Clewlow, Senior Client Advisor in NCC Group. And with me today is Keith Mcdevitt, Cyber Integrator at the Scottish Government, and fresh out of hospital this morning. So, 10 out of 10 for commitment to the cause. I would normally introduce our guests, but Keith, I'd like you to, just give a few lines on yourself to everybody today. Thank you.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thanks very much for the invite. So my background is 30 years in policing. And back in 2013, I was invited to join the Scottish Government to help develop their policy views and position on cyber. And since then, we've went from a single individual to a cyber team and a cyber position, policy and strategy. And currently, I lead in the team for liaison with the private sector and more often cyber incident response, and I'm the national lead for the national response.
Fantastic. Keith, thank you very much indeed. That's great to have you along, and thanks for making the effort. Also with us is Quentyn Tyalor, Director of Information Security at Canon Europe, who is sitting in an office 31 degrees. We've told him he can't have his fan on, so yet more commitment to the cause. Quentin, how about a few words?
I would like to correct you there. It was 31 degrees when I turned the fan off. It's now 33 degrees. Now my fan's been off. So if I start to melt here, it's okay. So I'm Quentyn Tyalor. I'm Director of Information Security. I look after Europe, Middle East, and Africa. I'm one of those unusual CISOs who's actually been in his role or in their role for quite some time now. I've now been head of security for 20 years at Canon, 21 years if you take other companies they bought. So unusual position, and it allows me to have a bit more of a long-term perspective on projects and implementations that perhaps people are not knocking people who move every few years maybe don't have.
That's great. Quentin, you're quite right there. Thanks very much indeed. And finally, I'm joined by my colleague here at NCC Group, Kat Sommers, our Director of Public Affairs, who's actually on leave today. So thank you very much, Kat, for sacrificing this time. Again, great commitment. Kat, just maybe if you say a few words about your role in the business, but also we've asked Kat if she would, not wanting to insult anybody's intelligence about ransomware, but we felt it was important just to baseline where we are with ransomware. And so Kat's going to give a very quick, well-researched intro on the sort of evolution of ransomware. And Kat, over to you.
Thanks very much, Ade. Yes, as Ade said, I lead NCC's political engagement, government relations and lobbying work. And as we all know, in light of how much cyber resilience is a team sport and requires the government to work with the private sector, it's been a very interesting role trying to work out how best we can support the national effort to fight cybercrime and make the UK the best nation to live and to work online. As I said, I've looked at the evolution of ransomware, and rather than kind of boring you with the definitions of what ransomware is, because you all, be much more aware of that than I am probably, or kind of run through the names of the various crime gangs or incidents, I just thought I'd share a few observations. We all know how pervasive ransomware is, and you'll hear it referred to as an epidemic, an existential threat, but also as $1 billion business for the people that undertake ransomware attacks. And just to kind of bring some of that to life, there is a very nice website that just reports the various attacks that happen around the world, categorized by type of attack. Just looking at some of the headlines from last month, from June, And bearing in mind that there is a statistic out there that a ransomware attack happens every 11 seconds nowadays. But you have headlines like Tunbridge Wells, Skinner's Kent schools closed after ransomware attack. Dutch pizza chain discloses breach after hacker tries to extort company. Ransomware group hits one of India's financial software powerhouses. Meat processor JBS paid $11 million in ransom to hackers. Brazil's Mackay municipality hit by ransomware. Japanese manufacturer Ito Yuguyu hit by ransomware. German textile retail chain Gary Weber hit by ransomware attackers. So just running through those headlines, you just see that it is everywhere, both geographically and around the world, but also in terms of the sectors and the type of companies that are targeted. So bringing to life the pervasiveness of it, we can see that, you know, it is not an exaggeration to talk about it as an epidemic. If you look at where it's come from and how it's evolved over the decades, allegedly the first reported ransomware attack happened in 1989. The shorthand that's being used is Ade Clewlow. It was distributed by floppy disk. I mean, even I remember floppy disks, but that is quite interesting. And the way in which victims had to pay their ransom was to send $189 to a PO box in Panama. So in terms of the analog world and how things worked back then, you couldn't make it more obvious. Compare that with today. In 2021, we're expected to see a total of 184 million ransomware attacks. I've not done the math as to whether that adds up to the every 11 seconds, but someone more clever than me can do that. Total cost is expected to be $20 billion. The general principle of, you know, what ransomware aims to do has remained the same. Malware distributed to targets with a view to extorting money to make profit. The fascinating bit about it is that if you look at how ransomware has evolved, it's such a good example of what happens when you've got that mixture of people taking advantage of technological advances, being driven by a very clear profit motive, and that dash of, you know, creative criminal ingenuity. And you just have this rapid innovation that's happened. And I should have hastened to add that if it weren't for the morally repugnant and devastating impact of it, you just kind of sit in awe and marvel at what cyber criminals have done in that space. You look at the technological evolution, we've gone from very opportunistic attacks, initially targeting single devices, then becoming more network aware, to then moving to self-propagating malware. And I think the most well-known examples are probably WannaCry and NotPetya. And we're now seeing quite targeted attacks at those companies that will suffer most from disruption and are therefore most likely to pay the ransom. So vulnerable industries in healthcare and education, managed service providers, those sort of firms. The kind of shorthand for that type or that trend is from spray to pray to big game hunting, which, you know, is probably more memorable. And then you've got other bits and pieces, like criminals used to write their own encryption code. They now use off-the-shelf libraries. They used to disseminate malware through floppy disks. Obviously, that is now much easier through phishing emails, spear phishing, and other advances in distribution techniques. Bitcoin wallets have made the collection of payments a lot easier. So you no longer need to send an envelope with some cash stuffed into it to a PO box in Panama. And there are other protective technology mechanisms around the actual malware. So more advanced development making, reverse engineering, more difficult use of online encryption methods, all that sort of thing. You then look at the evolution of the business model. And you go from that very simple model of you encrypt the files and ask for a ransom to kind of adjacent bits and pieces people have added to make more money off it. So you now got data exfiltration, data theft, you got the extortion element of it, and you've got things like adjacent DDoS attacks just to add that leverage to actually pay. You've got ransomware as a service, which, I mean, the pure genius of that, where you sort of go, oh yeah, we're going to take this as a service model as well and make money off it. So renting out malware on a subscription basis, and then whoever owns the malware gets a cut of the profits made from the ransom. It's genius if you think about it. But it's also around targeting new technologies, mobile devices, IoT devices, and making greater use of the ever-increasing attack surface. I'll come to a halt in a moment, but just a few comments on the back of all that, and we'll probably cover most of that as we answer the actual questions of the webinar. One is, if we'd listened to the experts early on, could we have predicted this proliferation and taken preventative measures earlier on? Or have we got to a point where we care about this existential threat now because we can actually feel the kinetic, the real world impact of what's going on? And, are we doomed to continue playing catch up because the agile ways in which criminals adapt and adopt and evolve their methods will always be faster than what we can do as defenders? And with that, I shall hand back over to Ade.
Well, Kat, thank you very much. There was some pretty impressive Japanese pronunciation in there as well, actually, and a really good kind of baseline for everybody going forward now. I mean, a couple of things from me. First of all, clearly something has to be done about this, and we'll discuss this in the third question. It can't just be left at the organisational level. Governments have to be involved, and I think, and not just individually. Of course, we need significant international cooperation as well. And it occurred to me the other day. My background: I was involved in piracy in Somalia 10 years ago, and actually, strangely enough, there are similarities about the issues and how we managed to resolve that, and maybe that's how we need to do it with ransomware going forward, albeit a lot more complex. So anybody watching, there's a Q&A box. We'd love to hear your comments and any questions you might have, and if you put in a question that's relevant, then I'll do my best to put it to the panelists. So let's open up with the first question and turn to Keith. Question is ransomware an event that we must now expect to happen? We all probably know the answer, but Keith, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we know the answer to that, but I think I'd like to just kind of reflect on sort of why we're here and reflect on my own background. So most of my policing service was in covert policing, organised crime investigations. And what we had with evolution of crime, and it's a natural thing that's always been the case, is there were two main drivers. One was power and one was profit, but they're not equal. So in the real world, the geographical aspect, the manner, the patch was important to defend. It was part of that kind of power piece. On the internet, that really doesn't exist the same. So you're left with profit. And profit is the major driver. And Kat mentioned the early stages of ransomware, where in essence what we saw was a fairly minor or maybe a fairly occasionally serious irritation more than anything else. But within a very relatively short period of time, it's developed to become, in some instances, a fairly high-end threat to operational delivery. And we could just ream off the organisations, particularly in the public sector, which is where my concerns primarily are, across the UK with organisations whose operational business has really been impacted very negatively. And for us in Scotland, manifest by the attack on the Scottish Environment Protection Agency on Christmas Eve, which effectively took the organisation out. These are big, big issues. And it's evolved because ransomware has become the cash cow of criminality. They've all gone there, like drugs and like counterfeiting and all the rest of it. There is big, big money to be made. And when people in the organised crime arena start to understand that, it's big returns for little effort. And no surprise that the very technology that is here to help us evolve is actually used against us. There can be no surprises to that. So I am not surprised that we've seen this transition to ransomware being developed and this high-end threat that we're now seeing really being in place. I couldn't say I would have predicted it, but I certainly saw it. And there doesn't seem to have been sufficient steps to try and really target this as a particular threat, although I would argue we're seeing a change there. So for me, yes, it's a growing threat.
So Keith, just back to you on that and your very unique position in Scotland. How would you describe the level of interest amongst senior politicians towards this threat? And you know, because we're obviously going to talk a little bit in the next 45 minutes or so about what the UK government, but other governments perhaps could be doing. Can you give just a quick sense before I turn to Quentin, what what that sense is?
Yeah, for sure. So if you were Scots, you might understand a little saying that's it's the talk of the steamy. And that really means it really is the focus of a lot of attention because we've seen it and we have felt the impact of it, and we have seen a fairly devastating impact in our close neighbours across in Ireland, and the health service are currently experiencing that. I can assure you that our departments and our ministers, not just in Scotland but across the UK, are increasingly concerned with the destructive nature of this attack and all that it entails, because as we will probably discuss, it's actually quite complex issue. It's a crime type, it's a threat, and there are many challenges to sort of addressing that threat. But I can give you assurance that this is really on the focus of our ministers' minds. And let's be realistic here, both at a UK level and at Scottish level. Our future is really pinned on the digital evolution. We push our citizens to a sort of digital first principle. We're going to make our countries greater and better by magnifying the opportunities that the internet and digital access provides. And therefore, anything that threatens that, and certainly when we're starting to see the real evidence of the threat manifesting itself in the ability to disrupt, significantly disrupt organisational behaviour, then that's a problem. So it most definitely is something that worries our ministers, and we, and our team in particular, are continuously notifying them of the events as we see them and supporting that picture building that's going on. So it's the two things that I guess would be keeping our ministers awake in relation to this threat are ransomware and the evolution of supply chain threats that even without very targeted attacks means that large organizations performing important roles and functions are vulnerable to attacks that actually can disrupt their operational capability, and that's worrying.
Keith, that's a brilliant contribution. Thank you. Quentin, I mean, as you explained when you introduced yourself, you've been in post for 20 years. That's very unusual. But it's given you a fantastic opportunity to see how this has grown as an issue. I just wonder whether you want to jump in there.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I have to say I am kind of unusual, and I'm not got anything against people who change jobs quite often, but it's when you see people who spend sort of like 18 months or less or a year in a role. And I've got projects that have gone on. In fact, I've got an investigation that's gone on for 10 years. And it's just interesting how you kind of wonder how these things get handed over or maybe don't get handed over. But yeah, it's an interesting position where when I first started, this stuff didn't happen. Malware was very much a case of something that you just rebuild computers. And I remember, I forget, was it Melissa that used to attach a random document to the malware and then send it out via email to everybody else. And I remember there being some quite salacious documents floating around on the internet from people having random documents sent away. So I suppose that really was sort of the nexus of a lot of this, with the breach and leak and the realization that you can either cripple someone's business from an availability standpoint, or you can actually leak and then affect their confidentiality. And with some of these big game hunting attacks, you can see they're doing one of those approaches or both of those approaches. But obviously, the attackers are thinking quite carefully, once they've got their victim, which approach is going to work effectively for them. So when we saw the fitness tracker that was down, availability was the key piece. Because people wanted to update their runs. If as my wife pointed out, if it doesn't log her run, it doesn't count. Merely the fact she might have done the run, but if the battery had died halfway through, that run doesn't count. She's got to start again, which is just an interesting attitude for many exercisers. But then you've also got the leak of confidential data, and this segues neatly into the question about protecting the crown jewels. What are your crown jewels? And I think there's a huge gulf between IT departments, what they think the crown jewels are, and the security departments, what they think the crown jewels might actually be, and between business leaders who you would assume do know but don't know, if you get my meaning, who may assume because this stuff's always worked. It hit home to me when we had a network outage here at the house, and suddenly both children, au pair, wife and everything just appeared out of nowhere and said, oh, the network's down. So, okay, well, I'll try and get it fixed. And then I realized how much of my house infrastructure didn't work because there was a DSL connection issue. I couldn't even use. I was cooking, and I couldn't even use the timer on my personal assistant because it needs a network connection to actually be able to do a timer. So I had to manually time on my watch how long the chips needed to be in the oven. So there's a lot of these things where you just don't understand what your crown jewels really are and what bits of your infrastructure are absolutely required for your job, or for your company to continue to exist. And I think it was really clearly put down and really crystallized by the ex-head of security for Maersk at a recent conference. And he said, the first thing you've got to ask people is, business people, is which one system do you want back first? And you'll get a whole list of systems. You go, that's great. Which one of those is going to come back first? Oh, it's all of it. No. Which one is going to come back first? And that's the important point. A lot of these people don't understand that you can only get these systems back, and there will be a first one, and what will that have to be? And a lot of people may need to fight it out to say, what's important in the company, what's not important in the company, what's politically important, what's actually important for the company to exist. And you know what? Every company is different. There is no right answer, and I can't give you a right answer.
Yeah, no, and that's actually what I wanted to just come back to you on. Clearly, Canon Europe, you would be a big, you'd be a big prize for a ransom. I'm not promoting this, by the way, for a ransomware gang or a group of criminals. But we will have people on this webinar who are from significantly smaller organizations, from the charity sector, micro businesses, and so on. And they will be, I expect, constantly asking the question, am I going to be vulnerable to ransomware? Am I going to be caught up in it? And we know that on occasion it's targeted, but we also know that it is quite it's quite random as well, particularly a supply chain type event. And
my suspicion
I just wonder what
your
thoughts are on that.
Yeah, my suspicion is that the vast majority of cases are probably untargeted, in that someone's cast the net wide and see who comes back and then starts looking at those. I think the tiny percentage of them are actually where an attacker goes out saying, I'm going to target that company. I think they do sector specific, so they kind of draw up a list of the targets that may be in a particular sector, taking a leaf out of the marketeers kind of like area where they target a particular sector for sales. I think that does happen, but I think the vast majority are just literally cast the net wide, see who comes back. And then in the supply chain, it's even more wide. And in actual fact, maybe like a double randomness, because they might have cast the net wide to see which supply chain targets they can pop. And then obviously the victims are on the back of that. I don't think everything's like the APT10, the Cloud Hopper attacks, where they took out a particular set of vendors because they wanted to take out those ones at the back end. Oh, no, I think they cast their net wide over a whole load of vendors, work out which ones they get into. Oh, and by the way, yeah, we also got that one, that one, that one, and that one. And you can see this with some of the random nature of some of the hospitals and charities. But to answer your question about are you at risk if you're a small company, I asked the question, do you have money? And even as a charity, you have money. You have IT infrastructure. You have stuff you'd rather prefer not to be leaked. And if you have money or you have data, you are at risk from ransomware or from criminals. Sorry.
Yeah, and
can I come in on that?
Yeah, Keith, go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I just really want to echo that. I mean, I think there's a real misnomer about organisations being targeted. There is no doubt in my mind, having looked at this over a long period of time, that the vast majority of organisations have been hit, have been fairly indiscriminate. It's thrown out to the wind because, criminals are lazy. They're seeking the best opportunity. Most of it's automated in the first instance. The best example was the Quentyn attack on SEPA. When you looked at the leak website, the organisations were on that span from large organisations to very, very small organisations. It was random. And it was just that the guy got behind the screen as soon as the malware was in and started to call home. Only at that stage do they show any interest, because that's a good return on investment. And this is all about making money. And that's the point. Do you have money? And what's the value of that to you? And I think for me, and this is why when I'm speaking to businesses in the public, private and third sector, what we're seeing is any business and any sector of any size that's connected to the internet, it could be them. And that's how they really have to think, because the nature of the threat has changed significantly in the last 18 months.
Yeah. Kat, just let me turn to you before we move on to the next question, which has already been touched on by Quentin. So you're sitting in an SME or even a micro business of whatever size, and yes, you do have money. There is money in the pot, but of course there are competing demands for it. Let me just touch on this. Cyber resilience is your only friend in this situation, isn't it?
Yeah, I would agree, and I think there is an education job to be done in that everyone talks about how much more sophisticated the ransomware attacks have got. Some of the ways in which the malware initially enters systems, I think, are still through very basic vulnerabilities. That if the low-hanging fruit of cyber weaknesses were addressed just through better cyber hygiene, relatively cost-effective, things like automate your patching, know what you're doing. So that will solve a lot of issues. I think actually WannaCry, as far as I understand it, is a really good example in that the NHS wasn't the original target. They were just very vulnerable because they still had the legacy systems running, and the vulnerabilities in those hadn't been patched, so were perfectly open for the exploit that the self-propagating malware used. And if you take that view and say, well, if you patch those and therefore make that entry point for any malware that bit higher, that's quite a good position to take. The challenge then is I completely agree, everyone's at risk. But saying that to someone who struggles with understanding the concept of cyber resilience at the best of times, you go back to that old FUD thing that we're trying to move away from. We don't want to scare people into submission because they just panic and find it all terribly complex and do nothing because they don't even know where to start. But having that very clear advice of just do the basics right, and you at least reduce the risk of being an accidental drive-by victim in a random, wide-ranging attack.
Yeah, thanks, Kat. So I think we'll move on to question 2. Quentin mentioned the subject of crown jewels data with the evolution of ransomware and their tactics of exfiltrating data, using that data to extort or to apply pressure to extort ransoms from victims, and then even releasing it just to play merry hell. And as probably I'm sure many people know, even beginning to offer the data up to competitors of that company that they've taken that data from. Data has become extremely important. So the question is, has the evolution of ransomware made protecting your crown jewels data even more critical? And I've asked Quentin if he would lead on this answer. So Quentin, over to you.
Yeah, so to build on my previous point, sorry, I thought I was answering that question back then. I was trying to be helpful, but to build on that point, I think the point is it's not about protecting the crown jewels. Protecting the crown jewels has always been important. It's about identifying the crown jewels so that you can protect it. And I think if you were to speak to a lot of CEOs and would say, what would happen to your organization if you were hit by ransomware tomorrow? I bet a sizable portion of those CEOs would turn around and say, we'll go back to the old paper-based processes. And I think that's the question you need to ask, and then say, okay, could you just show me that paper-based process and just show it working for me? Because I think that a lot of people are in denial and not realizing that they don't have a paper-based process. That in today's modern world, you can't have a scenario where your organization depends upon your people having a phone and being able to respond to their email at any particular point of the day, night, and wherever they happen to be. Gone are the days where a person would come around to your office and clear out your out tray and put the memos in your in tray, and then you'd lift those out and respond to those. By the way, I'm not that old, I don't remember that. But that's the old way of doing things. Now you send a message and it has to be responded to, and it is responded to. So I think the key bit is trying to identify what are your crown jewels, because if you don't know what they are, you can't protect them. And I think a lot of organizations don't know. I think a lot of senior executives, they know which processors are the crown jewels potentially, but they don't know what systems make up those processors that do the crown jewels. And I think a lot of IT people have spent so long defending against a threat which is defined. A lot of IT people are very used to dealing with threats like a data center fire or flooding. And flooding happens consistently. A data center fire happens consistently. It burns in a very consistent way. The data center fire doesn't see that you've started to put the fire out in data center 1 and suddenly decide to light a fire in data center 2. And this is the point that a lot of IT people have basically missed the point, is they don't understand that it's a human being at the other end. And so it's a human being who can dynamically choose which are the crown jewels, because I don't believe a company has one set of crown jewels. I think it has multiple sets of crown jewels, depending upon the individual part of the business, potentially depending upon the time of the year, depending on the time of the month, even depending on whether it's month-end close or not month-end close, depending. So a major retailer in the UK does a huge amount. They sell clothes most of the year, but right before Christmas, their online web store where they do their food is the place, and that makes them all the profit. So if you were to talk to them about their crown jewels, in January or February, you'd say, what about your Christmas food store? Yeah, don't really care about that. In October onwards, oh God, that's the main thing. And so that's what people misunderstand, is the crown jewels change, and they may be different depending on who you're talking to. And until you can start to identify what it is, you can't hope to protect it.
Yeah, and I think the point you made, actually in your previous comment about this, in terms of what is the first system that you want to come back up online, and that leads to the preparing for the incident, and then rehearsing what to do when this does happen, and that's something that I think is really important. I'm going to turn to Keith because I've got a question for you, Keith.
Actually, sorry, can I add one more point into that? Sorry, can I add one more point to that? Is also do incident simulation for people who have been through ransomware incidents. So some people will say to you, your Active Directory is the one they'll go after. Yes, attackers will go after AD because they want to move laterally, but they won't knock out your AD because they want you to be able to communicate so you can make the decision to pay the ransom. Because if they knock out your entire comms, then they're going to get paid later because you can't talk to your CEO and say, hey, pay, and your finance people can't receive the notification and say, you might want to go pay that. So it's just interesting how we've always held these kind of beliefs in our mind of the attacker will take that out and it'll cripple us like this. Well, the attacker needs you to exist in some way, shape or form so you can do what they want.
And of course, if you're involved in incident response as a cybersecurity company, you get to see how this, how attackers behave, and so, for example, in NCC Group's IR team, they have a lot of that experience, which is an interesting point to make. The question I have for you, Keith, is I wonder whether we need to be thinking about our data in a different way. I've got a public sector background in the military. You're in your role now. We grew up, and indeed, in when you were in the police force, we grew up with documentation of different classification, operating on different networks that were segregated from the kind of routine stuff, the much more sensitive, and then the really sort of TS, top secret type stuff was on another network altogether. And I wonder whether, even though it's generally only government that has got the funds to put that kind of network and that sort of system in place, and I'm sure that larger organizations have thought about this if indeed they haven't already introduced it. But I just wonder if this is something that we need to think about to try and protect that data in a different way, to make it harder for ransomware gangs to get their hands on it.
Yeah, so I think the nature of the threat of late, in particular with the supply chain threats, and not necessarily those who have criminal backgrounds, so more the kind of state nation piece, is starting to kind of dictate that. So I think we've went for fairly flat networks now, and segregation even hasn't been playing a massive part, because it's really all been about efficiency. And data's been data. But speaking about crown jewels and important information, important data, that then brings back the old thinking, quite frankly, on which data is more sensitive or more important than the rest, and what kind of wraparound do you give that? It's the old filing cabinet with the triple lock and all the rest of it. Who needs to have access to that? Sadly, I guess what that means is that's less efficient than making data just available. And the answers actually might also be in the very technology that's helping us evolve. So I think there is a good argument based on the threat that's posed, not on the and to do it, not because it's just a good idea, because I think it is a good idea, but actually the threat becomes a driver. So I think we probably will see some innovation around about that. And we would need that level of innovation now, because it's quite difficult in completely digital environments to treat it in the same way that you do physical data. In the old days, as you rightly say, it was much easier, but now it's more challenging. But I do think the technology and the innovation could probably help resolve that problem. The threat will determine it, or that real risk that's now visible and becoming understood by senior managers is really, I think, that fuel to get that kind of thinking going on.
Thanks very much, Kat. I wanted to turn to you. We've got a question from Thomas Coast, and I think Quentin, you might also want to jump in after Kat. Thomas has said that he's recently read that 66% of ransomware victims had up-to-date endpoint protection, and he asks, are there tools that we find particularly useful or innovative to protect businesses from ransomware? Now, I think from the purely the pragmatic perspective, Quentin, you may have something to say on that. But Kat, I just wondered whether you wanted to look at that and tie that in with the question that we've asked about protecting data and what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I'm pondering. As you say, Quentin will have a lot more technology advice, I think, to give. The one thing I think that I would point to as not necessarily innovation or an innovative tool, but something that needs to be done a lot better is, I think, threat and information sharing. And encouraging organizations to make widely known within trusted fora what they see happening to their own networks. So that early warning mechanism or early detection mechanism can actually happen, and other organizations can learn from someone else's experience and take measures to prevent themselves falling victim to a ransomware attack. And I guess where the technological innovation comes in is, what mechanisms are there, what tools are there to facilitate that real-time information sharing in a more effective and better way. But I wouldn't want to sit here and pretend that I can talk with authority about the latest AI or machine learning endpoint protection solutions that will solve the problem for decades to come. So over to Quentin on that, I think.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I think that if you're looking at direct protection mechanisms, I think that there are two aspects. And the key word in there is protect business from ransomware. Not prevent ransomware from happening in your business, but protect the business from the ransomware. So you've got your direct protection tools like your antivirus, your Microsoft tools like the Defender for Identity, used to be ATA, used to be ATP, whatever it's now called. It's now called Defender for Identity. Those things are really, really cool. Making sure you've got your EDR solutions in place. Antivirus, you know what, for what it's worth, you may as well have it, but your EDR is probably going to be the most useful thing there. And these are in your direct protection, direct detection and protection, and hopefully a bit of recovery in there as well. But you've also got your indirect protection, which is making sure your cyber hygiene is sorted out. Making sure you don't have large numbers of machines that are vulnerable to Eternal Blue. Because we all like to think that the attackers are very much Ocean's 11, but they're not Ocean's 11. They're opportunistic. It's like, for example, when you look at domestic burglaries, a lot of domestic burglaries are opportunistic. The person was walking past, they saw a window open, they went in. I had a neighbor here, for example, tell me that they knew about a keyless theft entry, and that they thought that their car had been broken into with keyless theft entry. Now, my CCTV caught the whole thing, and I could point out, actually, no, sorry, you left your door open. I can see you left your door open because your wing mirrors are out, and they just opened the door and went in and rifled through your car. And if they did keyless theft, they'd have taken the whole thing. But there's always that jump of, oh, whoever attacked us must be really, really great and must be really, really technologically advanced. And a lot of them aren't. Now, the ones who might come later, after the initial access broker has got into your network, they might be quite advanced, but the initial ones, maybe not. So make sure you've done your perimeter, make sure you've done your scanning. But the other thing as well is make sure that just accept the fact that ransomware is a fact of life. That someone's going to get at least a foothold in your organization, be able to identify that and shut it down quick. If you can do all of those three things, from your cyber hygiene to protecting your perimeter and stopping people getting in indirectly, and then making sure, look, if they are going to get in, and tell your senior management, tell them, look, if they get in, it's not that I haven't done my job, it's part of life. The next step, once they get in, is to actually get them out again and make sure they don't cause us a serious issue. And that's the important point. Getting hit by ransomware is inevitable. How you defend against it and how you get your company running again, well, that's entirely up to you.
Yeah, that's absolutely quite right. Quentin, thanks. Time is disappearing, but we're bang on cue to have a look at the third question and then to wrap up post that. The question is, what can be done to address ransomware? And at the moment, as anybody who may have listened to Kieran Martin in the last week or so talking, he's said pretty categorically, as we all know ourselves, that the conditions at the moment absolutely favour the attacker. And as an ex-military officer, that's never a very comfortable position to be in. And so what can we do to shift the balance? What can we do to try and address all aspects of ransomware from where they are based and operating from, to what organizations can do to try and be more resilient against it, which we've been touching on already, and whether or not we need to really seriously consider using every lever available through political, diplomatic, and if necessary, military means to remove that permissive environment in which they operate. So on that rather contentious last point, we've also had several questions come in, and there was a bit of a theme to them. basically around asking the question: should we pay ransoms, and should we be involved in paying ransoms, and what role should the cyber industry play when we know that certain cyber insurance policies will pay, if not all, but a large proportion of a ransom payment back to that organization once they have paid the attacker. So this is a really meaty bit of this conversation, I think. I'm going to start with Kat, but we'll move on from there. So Kat, over to you.
Thank you, Ade. I'll come on to the paying ransom or banning ransomware payments bit, which is just such a complex and difficult question to answer. Just to warn you that there might be a bit of convoluted thinking happening later on. But just to, in terms of the broader question of what can we do, going back to Kieran Martin's point of everything favours the attackers, I think he used a kind of three-pronged framework to explain that statement. And he said, they've got a really safe operating environment at the moment because they're, go pretty scot-free in Russia. Largely, they have structural weaknesses in terms of the vastness of cyber vulnerabilities and the paucity of cyber resilience across organizations that they can take advantage of. And there's, business model incentives such as insurance covering ransomware payments and the ease and non-traceability of crypto exchanges by which money does get paid. So I think if we look at what can be done to tackle ransomware, any strategy or any framework or any thing we decide to do needs to cover off all those 3 points to, make it a less favorable operating environment for attackers. So if you look at the first bit in terms of the safe international operating environment, there is currently pressure being exerted on Russia to go after criminals operating in their territory. I think the US have just announced new sanctions, for example. A lot of the communique coming out of the G7 summit and similar international gatherings have basically said, hey, Russia, please get your act in order. Now, there's a question as to how much you believe in the power of international fora to actually deliver outcomes and deliver concrete action in that space. But I don't think that can be ignored as an avenue and as an area of action. The bit around structural weaknesses, yeah, we've covered. There is a lot around basic cyber hygiene that can be done. There's a lot of defensive measure, and as Quentin says, making sure that when it happens, you are actually able to recover. And I'd extend that beyond the technical side of things to say, if you are worried about the risk of extortion, you should maybe also have a look at your general corporate governance. Because if there are so many things within your organization that risk embarrassing you if they were to become publicly known, and that's not covering confidential data and that side of things, but things that you might consider paying for because the reputational impact is just really bad if things come out. That's something you can address kind of earlier on in the process by maybe not having dodgy dealings or something like that. As I'm simplifying massively, but I think that's another thing that needs to be considered as part of the improving the structural weaknesses in the system. And then on the business model incentives, sorry, that does bring us on to the banning payments, regulating crypto exchanges, changing the insurance model side of things. And my personal view is it's very easy to say, yeah, of course we should ban payments, because at the moment all we're doing is funding criminal activity through that, and who knows what else that money is being used for. And there are existing structures in place around terrorist financing and all that, that will probably bite in some of those areas and make it more straightforward to decide whether or not a ransom should be paid. I think the additional consideration on that is think through the underlying consequences or the inadvertent outcomes of banning ransom payments. So what does that mean? If you take the view that the entire criminal ecosystem is this balloon, so if you press down on one side, it'll just pop up somewhere else. I think banning ransomware payments has that sort of effect, where you say, well, you take that avenue away, what else will criminals do in return? At least because we have seen that they are pretty adept at innovating and changing and doing things differently to respond to certain avenues being closed off. So I think those consequences have to be almost like war game through and fully understood before any decision on banning payments is made. The final point just to make on that is around understanding where ransomware attack thresholds lie in terms of national security impacts, and therefore the role of government to take offensive action against cyber criminals and cyber criminals infrastructure. And again, we've seen relatively effective international law enforcement operations taking down criminal infrastructure and thereby disrupting some of that, the business model or the business model incentives around that. And that's not to say that, we should just build a world cyber police and, sit back and relax and everything will be fine. But I think the effectiveness of some of those operations have shown that to be another viable kind of tool in the armory.
Yeah, thanks, Kat. I mean, and I don't want to stray too much into the sort of grand strategic sort of area and start talking about what can sanctions do and should we be heading down that road, because some of these countries already have a whole raft of sanctions applied to them already. So who knows what effect that would have. Keith, I want to come to you though, because in the US they set up a ransomware task force which involved pretty much every element of the cybersecurity community, and they reported. They put together some really interesting ideas. Those ideas are being actioned, and we seem to be doing very little here in the UK. And that, to me, it seems that ransomware. We haven't really had time to get into it in this discussion, but there is a significant impact from ransomware, and there is people talk about the threshold of which it becomes something that the government should be involved in. Well, the government should be involved in, and is involved in, ransomware attacks already. So the question, therefore, is, should we not be doing a little bit more about ransomware? And you may know a little bit that you can share with us from a leadership perspective and from an international leadership perspective. And don't forget, I need your answer on whether we should pay ransoms.
Yeah. Okay. So there's two parts to that. So whilst it may appear to be relatively quiet, we are very aware of that US report, both at a UK level and in Scotland. And there is actually quite a lot of activity cross-government, cross-nations on this specific issue of ransomware. It's been looked at currently in the widest terms. And I guess I'm limited to saying that you will hear more on this in due course. I am quite certain. So I guess that's all I can say on that piece. Trust me, there is a lot going on, and ransomware is a specific focus of activity. On the pay issue, so you'll be no surprise here from an ex-law enforcement officer. I started with a statement. Ransomware has become the cash cow of organised crime for a reason, and it's not the power, it's a profit. So in traditional extortions, kidnap situations, payment is a last resort, and I guess, and Kat alluded to the fact that a straight ban might be problematic, and that might well be the case. But it can never be a simple commercial decision to pay. It has to be on the greatest of need. So it just can't be. It's cheaper to pay than to rebuild That simply can't be good enough. And that's because it contributes to the ongoing criminality. It contributes to the continued victimisation of others who maybe are not as well prepared or indeed capable of paying. So there is a moral issue in that. And I think, and certainly within the public sector, we actively, and with the advice of the police, completely discourage any form of payment, because essentially it does that. It encourages criminality, and indeed for us in the public sector, it essentially paints a target on the back of the public sector, for example, and it would make them a more attractive target. So it is complex. It can't be a simple commercial decision. I think it would have to be a last resort, and it would have to be justified, and maybe has to be justified beyond the board of the organisation. I don't know. I mean, I think there's a lot more to be discussed around about that, but certainly not of convenience.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, it's hard not to argue with that position. Quentin, I'm sure you've got some very interesting thoughts on this. We have a couple of minutes left, Quentin, so over to you.
Yeah, so I would say that to pay or not pay a ransom is a decision that you shouldn't make before you're standing there staring into the breach. A lot of cybersecurity people will take we will never pay a ransom, and yet a lot of ransoms do get paid. And I think it's not up to the individual companies concerned to make the decision. So long as they are free to pay the ransom due to legal concerns, they should have to make that decision themselves while they're at that particular point. Now, of course, I would agree that paying ransoms is a fundamentally bad idea and perpetuates further victims. But are you really going to turn around to a board of directors or shareholders and say, we're going to take one for the team and this company will become non-viable because we don't want any further victims to be created? It's kind of a game of prisoner's dilemma, and the attackers know that. And so therefore, I don't think it's up to whether companies should pay ransoms. It's up to whether governments are going to allow ransoms to be paid. I don't think it's a company decision. And I think to make it a company decision is to make individual companies make ethical decisions, long-term ethical decisions for the fate of humanity, which are actually bigger than they can actually make. And I'd say, don't ever make a plan to say we will not pay. Put down the scenarios of what would make you go yes or no, and then make that decision at the time. Of more interest is the fact that cyber insurers are now starting to whack their premiums up dramatically. And that's an interesting topic, probably for another webinar.
Oh, yes. I think cyber insurance is definitely going to be on the list for another webinar. I mean, John Pocock did ask a question, which you may have seen in the Q&A, Quentin. Should organizations retain a ransomware negotiator on a retained basis? I won't go to the panel for that, but I'll go to you, Quentin, if I may, because for maybe a minute, in terms of what your thoughts are for that. No, I don't think you should. Yes, I should think, I would make sure that your cyber insurance, which I think you should have, has that as part of it. There we are. Thanks for that. Okay, so before we finish, we're going to do something we haven't done yet on our webinar series. Amina, who is producing this webinar and is in the background, hopefully Amina is going to put up on screen a very natty slide we prepared earlier. Hopefully someone's going to tell me that is live for the audience. If it is live for the audience, it is just a very simple short list of 6 actions. Now, there are many. These are 6 that we as a panel have decided that we think are probably the sort of key headlines, but of course, there are many more, and I know I'd be doing a disservice if I didn't say, if you want to know more, go to nccgroup.com to find out what else you can do. But I'm not going to run through them, but hopefully it's on the screen now, and you can take a screenshot. And if you have any further questions, obviously, please get in touch. Okay, I think we'll come off that now, Amina. Thank you very much. So that is all we've got time for. I'm sorry if we didn't get to every single question that was asked, but there were some that were very similar regarding paying ransoms and cyber insurance. And as I say, that's maybe something for another session. My thanks to Keith and Quentin and Kat, all of you who have got heat in your office, having just been to hospital, and Kat, go on leave, go into your garden and enjoy the sunshine. Thank you to Amina, who's produced this webinar, and also thank you to the audience for watching and for giving such interesting questions. We will be back with another episode of The Big Three very soon. So for now, thank you very much and goodbye.